Okay, let's. Should be good. So, folks at home, give me a thumbs up if you can hear me. Let's make sure that we check that first. And you can just do that by typing in the chat box if you want. Okay, good, excellent. All right, let's go ahead and let's see. Wait a minute. What am I doing? Make sure what I've got here versus here. Okay. All right, I'm going to share the screen. And there we go. Okay, today we're going to talk about aquatic habitats. Like, remember, we're talking about general types of habitats. On land, we call them biomes. We don't tend to call them biomes if they're aquatic, but they are the same thing. Now, before we get into that, I wanted to follow up on a question that we had last time about desertification and the patterns of rainfall that may or may not promote desertification or de-desertification. And I alluded to a project in Africa where they are planting a green belt across the southern end of the Sahel to try to reduce the rate of desertification and hopefully expand the arable area of that part of Africa. So I thought we would revisit that for just a second before we start with aquatic environments. So this is the Sahel, this reddish area here. Okay, and it is the southern border of the Sahara Desert. It expands to the south and contracts to the north, depending on what phase of climate we're in. It's actually quite damp during ice ages for whatever reason. But one of the things that's going on now with the warming Mediterranean is that there is a pattern of somewhat greater rainfall coming into the Sahel, and there's a real move to take advantage of that because a repeated desertification of this area over the last couple of hundred years has really impoverished the people who are trying to live there. So the idea then is to plant a massive green belt all along the southern border of the Sahara and thereby increasing rainfall. Okay, because one of the things that I alluded to, which we will come back to in lecture 34 sometime in November, is that 2/3 of the rainfall that falls in a particular area evaporates from within 20 kilometers of the spot where it falls. So you put plants in an area, you will get rain because they're transpiring moisture. So this is what the Sahel looks like in much of that area. It's very barren here at the top. And you see that people are trying to graze cattle. There's not much for them to graze. Here's what the hope is here at the bottom. This is a tropical dry forest. This particular one is a natural one over in the eastern end of the Sahel. But the goal is to increase the vegetation all along that belt. Now, it's not just people going out and randomly planting trees. There's actually a really interesting strategy, which I think is worth talking about. And that's These are circular gardens, Tulu Kiur, if I'm saying it correctly, that are planted by the inhabitants of this region. And here's one that's just been prepared for planting, and here it is a year later. This is not the same one, obviously, but after a year of growth, clearly you have some green. Hey, that's what the goal is. So why is it planted in a circular pattern? What they're doing is planting crops, medicinal plants, and most importantly, trees, because trees last the longest and need the least attention. They're planted in a circular pattern because if you do that, then the roots from these outer rings can grow inward, and you have to actually irrigate less area, irrigate a relatively small area. And if we do enough of these, you will actually transform the climate in this part of the world. This is not the only place that this is going on. There's also a great green belt that China is attempting to plant in the west to prevent the expansion of the Taklamakan Desert. So these initiatives can be very important. Yes. Oh, nothing stops the green from growing outward. That the question is, what would prevent it from growing outward? But the roots of these plants need moisture to get established, right?
Okay, irrigation. Okay.
Right. So irrigation in the center then allows them to get established. And once they get established, there's no reason why this can't expand. But this is the first step. I want to make 2 points about this. Number one, you have poor, impoverished villagers who are taking their future into their own hands. They're not sitting around moaning about how it's all pointless and we can't do anything. They are doing something. Okay? They're taking responsibility and they are changing their world as best they can. The second thing is, do you seriously think that a bunch of poor villagers in Senegal have the resources to do this on their own? No. They told the government of Senegal, we want this. You work for us, you will do this. Personal responsibility actually is important in maintaining a sustainable world. But what is even more important, and the reason that people feel like there's no point often, is because it's the institutions that preserve the status quo that seem like they're immovable. They are not. You don't like something? Throw the bastards out. Elect somebody else. Things happen in this country because you vote. One of my greatest, bitterest disappointments over the last 30 years is that so many of you have not voted. You've not voted for your own survival. I hope that you will do that. And sermon is over for the day. Okay, but personal work does work, and also making government serve you also works. Now, let's talk about aquatic habitats here. Okay, so here's our actual presentation for the day. All right, and remember we talked about terrestrial habitats as having characteristics that were determined by two things: precipitation, which was on the y-axis, and mean annual temperature, which was on the x-axis. Okay, we don't have such a neat categorization to show you for aquatic habitats, but there are basically a couple of things. What? How did that happen? What is that? What is this green box here? Stop that. I don't know how we got this green box. That's not supposed to be there. Well, we're going to carry on with the green box, I guess. I don't know. Not sure how to get rid of it. But they can be flowing or still, so water movement, right? They can be saline or fresh. okay? And they can be high oxygen, low oxygen. And these are the three main things that determines what kind of aquatic habitat we have: salinity, flow rate, oxygenation. So in freshwater habitats, we have lotic or flowing waters, those are rivers and streams. We have lentic habitats, which are lakes and ponds. And then we have wetlands of various descriptions. Some have greater flow than others, some are more saline than others, but they're basically swamps, marshes, and bogs. And I'll try to help you understand the distinction between them here. At the ocean margins, we have really interesting habitats. We have salt marshes, estuaries, and mangroves. And salt marshes and mangroves occupy estuaries, but in different parts of the world. We also have sandy and rocky shores on the ocean margins. And then among the ocean habitats, we have pelagic habitats, which are the open ocean areas. And then we have what we call neritic habitats, which are close to coastlines. This is a really important distinction, and it has a lot to do with the functioning of oceans as resources for humanity. So why do we have this? Well, I don't want to interrupt because I want to stay on schedule. What's that? Neritic is close to the coast. Yes, neritic is coastal. So let's take them a little bit at a time and give you some information on each. And there will be some things about flow, about oxygen, about salinity that you'll want to remember when you're trying to keep these things straight. So lotic habitats are flowing water. Streams are relatively small and narrow. Rivers are big. That's completely arbitrary. There's really sort of no agreed upon distinction between streams and rivers. This is, it's more of a gradation than anything else. And we don't really take it seriously because what we're interested in is the characteristics of the waters that are flowing. So downstream towards the mouth of a river or stream, you have a whole drainage basin emptying into the stream all along its course. And what that means is that by the time you get to the mouth of that stream or river, you've had an opportunity for a lot of things to have been washed into the river. On the other hand, in the headwaters, you're basically talking about pure water when you start. So there's a real difference in the productivity and characteristics of rivers and streams from their headwaters to their ends, their mouths, okay? Downstream ecosystems have a much more complex food web, and they support a lot more species. Upstream, you have relatively few species simply because they're just not that productive, okay? If you have a small enough stream, you're not going to get a lot of sunlight, and that will limit aquatic primary production by plants. On the other hand, in a large river, you have plenty of open water that's illuminated by the sun. You have a lot of primary production by algae. So let's think about this issue of things coming into the streams. What this suggests is that streams are connected to the landscape around them. Okay, they have a riparian zone, and that's the terrestrial vegetation alongside of those streams. Now that can flood, and if it floods, right, you have inundation by water, and then what happens? The water drains off from the riparian zone back into the stream, carrying nutrients. So we distinguish then between photosynthesis and primary production that has its source in the algae and aquatic vegetation within a flowing habitat, and that which has its origin in the material that is washed in from outside. So if it comes in from outside, we call it a lochthonous, okay? So it's washed into a flowing stream or river from the riparian zone. If it's autochthonous, it's the plants that are already in the system that are producing the primary production. Okay, so in streams, they're small. Most of the organic matter is allochthonous, but in rivers, increasingly as you go towards the mouth, it's mostly autochthonous. And this is a big issue for aquatic ecologists, trying to understand the source of nutrient inputs that support aquatic ecosystems. So, lentic habitats then are still waters, ponds and lakes. Again, that's totally arbitrary. Okay. Lakes and ponds in many parts of the world are formed as glaciers retreat, leaving little pockets where they've dug out soil. That is true of most of the lakes across the northern United States and Canada. Many of the lakes in Europe and Central Asia are also the results of retreating glaciers. Okay, but then again, if you've got glaciers scouring the land and carving out little pockets that later fill with fresh water, there's maybe not necessarily a lot of organic matter in there or to support a food web. So it's not like these are not also tied to the landscapes that surround them. They do have allochthonous material that gets imported. Now, there are zones in lakes and streams, and we're going to introduce some terminology that will replicate as we talk about ocean basins also. So first is the littoral zone. This is where you have emergent plants like reeds that grow up out of the water into the air. Okay, then you have a limnetic zone, which is the open water. So this right here is littoral, and you have rooted plants along the edge of the body of water that grow up into the air from under the surface. But in the limnetic zone, it's too deep for rooted plants to emerge. So the plant life there is mostly algae. Okay, you have a profundal zone at the bottom, and that is often oxygen poor for reasons that we'll see in just a second. And then you have a benthic zone. The benthos is simply the bottom of any body of water. It has a lot of burrowing organisms. It actually can have a fairly rich food web. Yes. Yeah, like springs. Yeah. Right. Yeah. So the question is, how do we characterize things like springs, for instance, the springs in Florida where the manatees hang out? Well, actually, those are not necessarily freshwater. Manatees don't like fresh water that much, but really, that's kind of a special case, and we don't try to force it into either lentic or lotic. We just take it on its own. So that's an important lesson, actually, though, because often in this course, we're going to give you terms to guide your thinking about things, but we're not going to make you apply them in a hard and fast rule. So this is a community, right? But there's no strict definition of what a community has to be. So we do have flowing waters, lotic. We have still waters, lentic. That's not to say that all of the freshwater bodies that we might study fit neatly into one or the other. Have a little flexibility. This can be frustrating for people, though, because often people are used to having like this category and this category. Those categories are much more blurry in ecology sometimes. So keep that in the back of your mind. But littoral, the edge, limnetic, which we will call pelagic in the open ocean. That's the open water. Benthic is the bottom, and profundal is the water deep water that generally has very little oxygen. Now, we have this layering in bodies of water, and this is worth investigating because it's key to understanding the production and food webs that you find in bodies of water. So the epilimnion, I warned you there was a lot of vocabulary in this section. Don't freak out, but just try to follow along. The epilimnion, epi means surface. So clearly it's the surface waters. Okay, these are exposed to the atmosphere. They can have fairly high levels of oxygen. Okay, the hypolimnion, though, is down here in what we would call the profundal zone. And often it does not have high levels of oxygen because it's isolated. Now, why is it isolated? Because typically in a body of water, you have a sharp change in temperature partway down. The surface waters get warmed by sunlight, and that warmth only extends so far down. And at some point, you start encountering waters that have not been warmed for a very long time. So they've lost a lot of their heat. So there's this abrupt change from relatively warm water at the surface to colder water at depth. That's called the thermocline. Okay, so the thermocline basically serves as a cap. It serves as a separator that prevents the mixing of deep water and surface water. So where's all the oxygen? It's in the epilimnion. Where's all the nutrients? Well, when things die, they sink to the bottom, so it's all in the hypolimnion. How can you get nutrients and oxygen in the same place at the same time to support photosynthesis? Oftentimes you can't. Okay. You may have a lot of anaerobic bacterial metabolism down here at the bottom of the body of water simply because there's just no oxygen. That limits production. Okay. Now, it's not hopeless because lakes and ponds do mix those waters. They tend to mix them in the spring and the fall. During the summer and winter, they tend to be fairly stratified. But they undergo what we call overturn in the spring and the fall. And here's how that works. Let's first take like spring. Okay, so it's been cold. And of course, what we're looking at here is an example body of water from, say, New Hampshire or something a little further north than us, where you have a colder winter than we typically have. And this is where this was described. So here you have a relatively cold body of water that's stratified that now starts to warm up in the spring as the sun shines for longer periods of time. Okay, and as it does that, wind can push the waters around and cause an up and down circulation pattern. Remember, we had upwelling in the ocean basins. This is the equivalent in fresh waters. So you have then the ability to mix the surface waters and the deep waters in the spring as the temperature starts to rise and as wind mixes those waters. Now, you may have wind all year long, but it only has a limited ability to mix the waters once the surface waters get too warm. During the summer, it doesn't matter how much wind you've got, you're not going to get a lot of mixing because these epilimnion waters are so warm that it is very difficult for them to be forced down. That's where you get a really strong thermocline. And so summer production is not as great typically as it is in spring. In the fall, you get cooling, and the temperature gradient then between surface and deep waters starts to break down. Once again, the wind is then capable of mixing those waters. And so you get a spring algae bloom, typically in these kinds of waters, as nutrient-rich deep water mixes with oxygen-rich surface water, and again in the fall. But the summer and winter tend to be more stratified, less productive. course, in the winter, you don't have the capacity to cause overturn a whole lot. But this is why there are seasonal blooms in these freshwater bodies. Okay. So to summarize here, we have spring overturn when wind is capable of causing mixing of waters that don't vary in temperature a whole lot. We have summer stratification when the surface waters warm too much to be forced down, causing a reduction in the vertical movement. We have a fall overturn when the temperatures once again become more similar in the surface and deep, and the wind is then capable of driving the surface waters down. Okay. Now let's talk a little bit about freshwater wetlands. That's us. So we have standing fresh water. Actually, there's a gradient in many of our wetlands from completely fresh to mixed to salt. So we have freshwater marsh, mixed marsh, and salt marsh here in South Louisiana. Okay, now we distinguish these on the basis of their vegetation typically. And that's because swamps have a relatively high rate of water flow. It's not like a rushing river falling down a mountainside, but it is a steady, slow movement of water past a fixed point. And what that means is that if you have respiring roots at a fixed point, those roots are going to take oxygen out of the water as they respire. That's going to be rapidly replaced by more water that contains more oxygen. So you can support trees in areas where water flow is reasonably, I don't want to say fast because it's not really ever fast, but where there's significant water flow. On the other hand, if you have relatively sluggish water flow, it's very easy for plant roots to deplete the oxygen in the water. That means that you cannot support large plants. That's the difference between a swamp and a marsh. A marsh has lower rates of water flow that limit the oxygen available to plant roots and prevent trees from growing. Bogs are still areas that generally often do not have an outside drainage, so they fill up, but they're not sufficiently big to be considered something like a pond or a lake. In fact, they have a very shallow body of water, and they tend to accumulate acid, and that's a very special habitat that we don't find here very much, but we do in the Northeast. So we're looking at differences in oxygen level that distinguish swamps from marshes. Okay, yes? Are geysers bogs? Yeah. Okay, so are the geysers in Yellowstone considered bogs? Once again, this is an area where we're not going to try to force something like a geyser into a neat category. We're going to take it on its own. Geysers may be acidic, but they are not regarded as bogs. They're generally too hostile an environment to support plant life. And what we're talking about here is bogs that do support plants. Okay, you can support microbes, you can support, say, thermophilic microbes in a geyser, but not plants as we know them. So we would not try to force them into these categories. Okay, and I know that's probably frustrating, but get used to it. I'm going to frustrate you a lot in this course. Yeah. Okay, bogs have very, very highly specialized plants and animals. Generally, they are very poor in animal life because most animals cannot tolerate the level of acidity that you find in bogs. You have a lot of microbial activity, but not a lot of larger animals. All right, now we're going to move to the continental margins where these freshwater bodies empty into the ocean. And we're going to consider two types of marginal habitats on the continental margins. And that is salt marshes and mangroves. They occur in similar situations that differ in temperature. Salt marshes are these dark outlines here. And you see that they're predominantly at higher latitudes than about 30 degrees. Okay, so from 30 degrees to the poles is where you tend to find salt marshes mostly. Between 30 degrees north and 30 degrees south, salt marshes are often replaced by mangrove swamps. They are occupying the same kind of habitat, just with different temperature ranges. Okay, so these salt marshes are the ones that you are pretty familiar with from Louisiana. You drive down towards the coast and you see large vistas of what look like grass. Well, those are reeds and other vegetation that's rooted in the water. It's not actually grass for the most part, although there are some grasses that grow there. And it has the appearance of a grassland, but it's an aquatic habitat. Okay. And generally, you're going to find these salt marshes in areas where the water temperature tends to be 16 degrees centigrade or lower. And if the water temperature is consistently above 16 degrees centigrade, that's where mangroves tend to have an advantage. So for those of you who haven't seen a mangrove swamp, it is a real tangle. But in both cases, the structure of the plants provides habitat for young fish, and these are the most important nurseries of our fisheries that we have. This is where most of the commercially valuable fish breed. There's also a lot of organic matter there for them because that organic matter supports microbes. There are small animals that eat those microbes. The baby fish eat the small animals. That's why they're kind of outsized in their importance. Okay, so summary here, salt marshes are found at the continental margins. And remember that you may have a gradient from fully freshwater marsh to fully saltwater marsh that is characterized by different species. But you have water moving through this marsh at enough of a rate that it can support things like fish. Can't support trees, they're too big, but it can support things like fish. Okay, and the key thing is the relative temperature, where the water temperature is below 16 degrees centigrade for much of the year. That's when you get salt marshes. Okay, continental margins are usually they're usually associated with the emptying of large rivers. So the Mississippi is an example of a deltaic area that supports large marsh habitats. The mouth of the Amazon, well, not the mouth of the Nile, because that's in a desert, but most of the major rivers in the world support these salt marshes if they're in temperate areas. Okay, and they are incredibly productive, as you will see in lecture number 35. Okay, mangrove swamps are simply the tropical analog. The temperate analog of a mangrove is a salt marsh. The tropical analog of a salt marsh is a mangrove. Okay, so here's a little black mangrove. And really interestingly, you can have these little mangrove forests go on for miles and miles and miles. In Panama on the Atlantic coast, near the exit of the Panama Canal, there are enormous mangrove swamps that run all the way up the coast of Panama, all the way to Costa Rica, and all the way down into Colombia. A really amazing habitat. So just as salt marshes do, they receive inputs from the continents by rivers emptying into these areas, and they provide habitat for many species of aquatic life, including our major food resource fish. Okay. The thing about mangroves is that they are unusual because most trees cannot tolerate salt, right? We have a number of grass-like plants that grow in salt marshes that do tolerate salt, and that's not that unusual for those small plants. But for trees, that's really hard. So one of the things that we will look at when we look at aquatic adaptation is how mangroves manage this. Okay, then moving out away from the emptying of the rivers, we have sandy shores and rocky shores. That's what we call the intertidal or littoral zone of the oceans. Okay, and it's just what you see between the mean low tide mark of the ocean and the start of the terrestrial vegetation. So in Louisiana, this is pretty hard to see, but as you go to the East Coast, more towards, say, Florida or Georgia, you see then that there are sandy shores on the beaches of that coastline that grade into sand dunes that are eventually anchored by vegetation. That's the zone we're talking about, the intertidal zone. So between the lowest of low tides and the highest of high tides, strictly speaking, that's what we're talking about here. So that can be sandy, and here's this is actually muddy. This is a mud flat here on the left with some birds foraging, or it can be rocky. And here's a rocky shore on the coast of Washington State. And there's a lot of zonation in these habitats, depending on the amount of water that they experience. Organisms that live high in the intertidal zone have to be adapted to drought functionally because they are only covered by water very briefly at the highest of high tides. As you move down in the intertidal zone, you get to fully marine species. And in the middle, you have a wide variety of species that tolerate a range of conditions. And this will be important when we talk about things like competition, because this habitat gave us some of the first clues about how to think about the phenomenon of competition between these organisms that have these different tolerances for the environment. Okay, finally, the open ocean here. The open ocean is away from the neritic habitats of the shorelines, the mangroves, and the reefs. And so we have the neritic area, which is continental shelf, basically, where we have things like kelp forests and reefs. But then we have all the rest of the ocean, the 70% of the Earth's surface. Okay, once again, we are going to use the same kind of terminology that we used for ponds and lakes. So we have a neritic zone, and that is now defined generally by the depth of the continental shelf. Generally, we cut off the neritic zone as anything that is 200 meters deep or less. So from the shoreline out to 200 meters in depth, we consider that the neritic zone, the continental shelf, highly productive zone. Beyond that, we have the pelagic zone. So what that means is that if you have a shallow coastline, the neritic zone may extend for hundreds of miles offshore. On the other hand, if you have a very steep coastline, it may only be 10 miles or so. The Pacific coast of North America is extremely steep, and the neritic zone is relatively small. On the East Coast, that neritic zone is much larger because the rate of elevation change under the surface of the water is very slow. So you have a very gradual decrease in the bottom depth. So much greater area of neritic zone in the east coast than on the west coast. That doesn't mean that it's more productive though. So the pelagic or oceanic zone is well beyond the immediate area of the continental shelf. And generally by the time water gets out there, most of the nutrients have been bled out by organisms living close to the coastlines. So the open oceans are not all that productive on a comparative basis. You have the upper area of the ocean, right? And we call that the photic zone. And of course, there is a corresponding zone in lakes and ponds. It's the same thing, but we had somewhat different scientists describing them, so they used slightly different terminology. But it's the same thing. It's the area of the ocean that receives sunlight that allows photosynthesis to occur. Okay. And that extends down, guess what, about 200 meters, which is kind of the rationale for us cutting off the neritic zone at about 200 meters. So the top 200 meters of the open ocean is where all the business goes on. And then the aphotic zone kind of corresponds to that profundal zone or hypolimnion when we're talking about lakes and ponds. So it's the same scheme, the same zonation, slightly different terminology. All right, so here's a little diagram. Here's our 200-meter deep photic zone. That's where everybody wants to live. The aphotic zone is very unproductive because there's no photosynthesis. Light can't penetrate that far down. And basically, organisms that live in the aphotic zone are subsisting on animals and plants that die up here and sink down. Okay. The benthos is the same term in the ocean and lakes and ponds. That's the bottom layer where you have burrowing animals. So here's your neritic zone along the coastlines. Here's the pelagic zone, which is the entire ocean away from the coastlines. The pelagic zone has an upper photic and a lower aphotic zone. Right, so the open ocean then lacks nutrients, which are mostly captured by organisms in the neritic zone, close to the coastlines. That neritic zone is extremely productive. That's where most of the ocean production goes on. And it goes on because of two habitats, again, a warm water analog and a cold water analog. In cold water, you get kelp forests along these coastlines. So the neritic habitat in cold water is generally a kelp forest. That is where ocean waters are generally under 20 degrees centigrade. And notice that once again, you get the zonation here, mostly at higher latitudes, and then between 30 north and 30 south, those kelp forests are replaced by coral reefs. So they are the analogs of one another. Now, coral reefs, pretty much everybody in this room probably knows, are the richest habitats in the oceans. They are sometimes called the ocean's rainforests because of the biological diversity that goes on. And they are in relatively shallow waters. They're in the photic zone, right? Because they're built by animals that harbor plant symbiotes in their tissues. The plant symbiotes do photosynthesis. They give the animals some nutrients, and the animals capture raw materials for them, like dirt, crud, that they can break down and turn into nutrients. So corals are animals. They harbor algae. And when a coral reef bleaches due to high temperatures, the algae are expelled from the animal tissue. That's what bleaching actually means. Okay. So the reef itself is built of the skeletons of those animals. They're not plants, they're animals building those reefs. Now, you probably know a lot less about kelp forests, but this is definitely the temperate analog. They are incredibly productive. Kelp is an alga. It can reach lengths of 200 to 300 meters, single plant, and it can grow 6 meters a day. So this is really productive. It's in very cold water that is relatively nutrient rich. And so it can sustain high levels of biological production. The complexity of a habitat that is colonized by kelp, you can see it's a 3-dimensional habitat here on the right that extends all the way from the surface where the kelp may be kind of floating in mats on the surface, all the way down to the bottom where it's anchored. And it's a highly complex environment that produces lots of ways for organisms to make a living. And so this is by far the most species-rich part of the temperate and Arctic and Antarctic oceans. This is where most of the production occurs in the temperate oceans. And most of the fisheries that you are familiar with have their origins in a kelp forest somewhere. Okay, so temperate analog, tropical analog. The coastal margin temperate biome is the salt marsh. The temperate neritic biome is the kelp forest. The tropical coastal biome is a mangrove swamp. The tropical neritic biome is a coral reef. They have similar temperature preferences, not exactly the same. The distinction between salt marshes and mangroves kind of breaks off at about 16 degrees centigrade of water temperature. It's a little bit warmer for the distinction between kelp forests and coral reefs is about 20 degrees centigrade. But that's a handy way to remember what's going on with these aquatic habitats. Okay, and now that we've talked about terrestrial and aquatic habitats, we will start to talk about the adaptations that organisms have to have in order to live there. That's what we will do next time. If you're coming to lab today, meet us in Bio 216. And I cannot guarantee that it won't rain on you, so you might want to bring rain gear and boots. Okay, everybody, I'm going to stop the share. And I'm going to end this for us. Nice to have you all. See you later.